Myself, but with the mic on. Today we welcome 3 panels to testify on the conditions of military privatized housing. The first panel will be 2 family representatives who are here to tell their personal stories. The second panel will be representatives from 5 of the 14 of the private companies, Balfour Beatty Communities, excuse me, Corvius, Lend-Lease Americas, Hunt Military Communities, and Lincoln Military Housing. The third panel will be a representative from the Office of Secretary of Defense, Mr. Pete Potochney, and Ms. Elizabeth Fields from GAO. The focus of this hearing is to hear from family housing tenants, DOD, and the private companies on the corrective actions being taken to improve privatized housing and the way forward to sustain the corrective actions. In August 2018, Reuters published the first in a series of articles chronicling health and safety issues experienced by military families living in privatized military family housing. These articles prompted an ever-increasing number of military families from across the country to come forward with their experiences, many of whom I've had the chance to talk to on visits to military bases and seen firsthand the deplorable conditions in some of the housing and how long the conditions were allowed to persist without response from the private companies. The large geographically diverse group of families indicated that there were systemic failures in the privatized military family housing program. Families of all services, ranks, and pay grades have reported health problems related to lead and mold exposure, rodent infestations, rude and dismissive housing management, and ineffective oversight of the program by the services. The following February, I'm sorry, can we close the door? If we need to let people in to fill the seats, I'm sorry. Let me pause for a moment. Okay. Can we bring... Gentlemen, no more talking or disrupting the hearing. Okay. Do we want to just let people in who want to come in? This is everybody who wants to be here? For right now. Okay. All right, great. No. Thank you. Apologize. The large geographically diverse group of families indicated that there were systemic failures in the privatized military family housing program. Families of all services, ranks, and pay grades have reported health problems related to lead and mold exposure, rodent infestations, rude and dismissive housing management, and ineffective oversight of the program by the services. The following February, Pentagon officials directed the leaders in their respective services to take immediate action to assess the scale and scope of installation housing issues, to include outreach to military families with the author of housing inspections to help document health and safety concerns. Soon after, the military services began weekly meetings to analyze the data coming back from the field and began to address the systemic issues that were causing the problems being encountered by families. We had a hearing last year during our appropriations process and heard really unfortunate circumstances that were unacceptable and that were mind-blowing to most of the members of the committee, to all of the members of the committee, who just couldn't wrap our minds around the idea that we had so many military families who were neglected and ignored and blown off for so long. It's just an unacceptable situation, and that's why we're going to continue to make sure that we have oversight hearings on the conditions and ensuring that we're riding herd on the implementation of necessary and vital changes. Many of the problems experienced by military families appear to be products of poor management by private partners and insufficient or ineffective oversight by military services, which quite frankly they acknowledged when we had them before us in our hearings last year, the military side. Many military families have complained about the maintenance support they have received from the partners. Family member complaints include the following: general unresponsiveness, long response times, failure to communicate, failure to keep appointments, and failure to adequately address issues which raise health concerns. While the services continue to maintain housing offices, they have reduced the number of personnel that work at these offices. This understaffing is often exacerbated by co-locating the few remaining service housing personnel with the private partner management team, leading to families often feeling uncomfortable about making complaints about the private partner to their service liaisons because they're sitting right there in the same room. I don't understand how that could be that could be helpful or make any sense. Another systemic issue is a lack of involvement and oversight by senior installation leadership and the service member tenant's chain of command. Failure to understand or execute their role in ensuring that service members and their families have adequate housing has contributed to family members believing they have no place to turn for help with housing concerns. The services report that a lack of visibility on work order processing has contributed to the overall lack of oversight. In addition, the current system incentivizes work order completion without respect to the quality of maintenance performed, which has led to poor workmanship and unqualified personnel performing the work. An overemphasis on occupancy rates incentivizes quick turnover of homes, which in turn can lead to a lack of preventive maintenance of homes between tenants. And finally, I recognize that some of our witnesses are parties in ongoing litigation. I do want to remind members to ask their questions while keeping in mind that witnesses might have to limit their responses due to this ongoing litigation. At the same time, this is an important issue, and the committee expects that each witness will endeavor to answer members' questions so we can continue to conduct the essential oversight that is our responsibility. I don't expect today that we will tolerate a lot of answers that refer to a lawsuit and witnesses being unable to answer as a result. But we're going to be sensitive to that, to those issues. We have a lot to cover today. I'm looking forward to a good conversation that will help make sure that we can learn what has been accomplished over the last year and a half and how far we have to go. And at this time, I'd like to yield to my ranking member, Judge Carter, for his opening statement.
Thank the chairwoman for yielding. I'm going to make this short. I look forward to this hearing about changes and improvements made to military family housing over the past year. I also look forward to discussing how the additional $1.41 million of this subcommittee provided in fiscal year 2020 is being used to increase the services' ability to provide oversight and management of their housing portfolios, and what the plans are for the next fiscal year. With that, I thank you and I yield back.
Thank you, Judge Carter. Not seeing Chairwoman Lowy or Ranking Member Granger, we now welcome our first panel. Our witnesses are Colonel Scott Gerber, Ms. Lynn Gerdovich. The witnesses are military individuals or spouses who are current or recent residents in military family housing, and their stories are like many from around the country. They will describe the conditions they encountered, the difficulties they faced in persuading appropriate officials to address serious maintenance issues in their homes, and the problems with the remediation efforts undertaken by the contractors. Because we have 3 panels today, we're limiting the length of the witness testimony, all of the witnesses' testimony, to 3 minutes. So without objection, we'll show that done, and we'll proceed with our first witness. Colonel Gerber, your full written testimony will be included in the record, and you are recognized for 3 minutes to give us a summary.
Wasserman Schultz, I'd actually been told I had a 5-minute statement to make.
No, we had to revise that to 3 minutes. So
okay.
If you can summarize your testimony, and your full testimony will be entered into the record.
Well, you pay me to be flexible, so I will be. Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz and Ranking Member Carter, thank you for inviting me to testify today. Your continued vigilance on the military housing crisis is appreciated. Sandy, my wife, and I lived in Corvius housing on Fort Meade, and we want to share our experiences. Frankly, the fact that the Gerdoviches went through the same thing that we went through a year later, a year after the testimony, a year after the contractors promised to fix this, is shocking. Our message is simple. The military families need a level playing field with the contractors today. We need to do it before another child is exposed to toxic mold, pest infestation, or other hazardous conditions. Giving us a chance to fight for the ones we love requires 3 things. First, full implementation of the Tenant Bill of Rights. Second, expanding the role of military families and advocacy groups in the formal discussion. And third, employing independent inspectors. As my written testimony documents, Sandy and I lived through 2 mold-infested homes where we had mold and insulation blowing on us. We couldn't get acceptable maintenance. Contractors told us that black mold in our house was okay. And as a result, everything we had was covered in mold, and my wife, a former distance runner, now has asthma. Moreover, our situation wasn't unique. A number of families reached out to us. We saw elderly parents and kids living in mold-infested rooms. We sat with one young couple while they realized they had to throw everything they owned away because it was covered in black mold and then begin everything again, paying out of their own pocket. In a home for a recovering cancer patient, we found the contractor running an industrial air cleaner before a mold test. We hired an independent home inspector, which Sandy and I hired, found water damage and toxic levels of mold in 13 of 16 homes, including 6 of 7 homes the contractor had recently built for junior enlisted families. Sandy and I continue to hear problems from families on the installation. As a matter of fact, this morning someone reached out to Sandy. So I would ask that we realize to meet Congress's goals for privatized housing, we have to establish oversight. If we don't establish oversight, money is not going to work. How do we do that? One, full Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights that was approved is missing the 3 things that tenants need to have a level playing field. The ability to withhold BAH, dispute resolution, and a 10-year maintenance. Second, Judge Carter and Congressman Bishop hit the second key in their 2019 Housing Act, which said, bring the families in. Bringing the families into the process, into the formal process, is a game-changing innovation because in 2018 and 19 we showed we can bring these issues to light. Finally, the government needs to bring in external housing inspectors to give commanders an unbiased assessment, because what we saw in Fort Meade was not unbiased. I've deployed to combat 3 times. I've executed over 400 combat patrols. I carry a list of 42 friends and comrades we lost in combat, 6 of them under my command. So when I see what I saw in Fort Meade, it's personal. We cannot send people into harm's way wondering if their family's in danger from the house they live in. We've got to level the playing field between the families and the private contractors and ensure this doesn't happen again. While the contractors will highlight their investments, I think we can all agree more money is going to achieve little without accountability. Thank you for allowing me to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Colonel Gerber, and you can share more of your testimony with us as we proceed with questions. And you're right, you face enough enemies in combat. Your house shouldn't be among them. I appreciate your remarks, and now I'll recognize Ms. Gerdovich. Your full written testimony will be included in the record, and you're recognized for 3 minutes to summarize your remarks.
Good morning. My name is Lynn Gerdovich. My husband James is an Air Force colonel. We are the proud parents of 6 children. We're the proud parents of 6 children ranging in age from 1 to 13. We moved to Bowling Air Force Base 6 months ago. James could enroll in the Senior Executive Development Program at Fort McNair. This was our 14th move in 15 years. We chose to live on base because we thought it would offer an affordable, safe place for our children. We never imagined our home would compromise the health of our family. As I tell our story, please keep in mind my children, especially my youngest son, 2-year-old Rollin. He was born with a condition that happens only once in every 400,000 births. He has cloacal exstrophy. Essentially, he was born with his organs, the bladder, intestines, and reproductive organs outside of his body, some split in half and inside out. He has only 1 kidney and is diagnosed with spina bifida. His young life has been a series of surgeries and medical procedures, and he has many more to come as doctors try to give him the life all children deserve. Through it all, he is a vibrant little fighter who brings our family incredible joy. A multidisciplinary team of specialists, including 5 different surgeons, oversee his care at Johns Hopkins Hospital. In order to not have blanks in his medical charts, I am required to be vigilant about his medical history, things that he's been exposed to, so that I'm armed with the ability to answer any questions that come my way from the many different specialists and doctors we deal with. The home we leased in September on Bowling Air Force Base smelled foul the moment we moved in. Within days, all my children developed respiratory symptoms. The younger ones, like Rollin, had hacking coughs and constant congestion. My 9-month-old baby Ansel endured a fever that reached 104.5 degrees. Suspecting mold, we asked Hunt to come test our home. Despite their moisture meter signaling high levels of moisture, they dismissed this to temperature and told us our home was safe. After learning our house had never been approved for occupancy, Base Command came by to inspect, but they were forced outside by what they experienced inside. The Vice Commander's eyes were watery and she was dizzy. She said, "There's something bad inside your house," and ordered a third-party inspection to come properly test for mold. The day prior to that inspection, however, Hunt scrambled to clean our entire duct system, thick with dust, and completely replace both our furnace and HVAC system. The third party they hired reported back to them, not me, so it was almost 2 more weeks before I learned that the bathrooms did in fact require extensive mold remediation. After being told it would take a week, we were put into temporary housing for what ended up being a little more than 2 months. Our family of 8 was in a 3-bedroom home. 2 of our children slept on a mattress on the floor in the dining room. We asked Hunt to test for the mold type, and they refused. This was important for my son, Rollin. Ignoring my pleas to then just preserve samples so we could test, Hunt quickly and conveniently disposed of the bulk of the materials before I could hire my own inspector to sample them. Our inspector, however, still was able to determine that our home's extensive mold contamination included Stachybotrys and Aspergillus penicillium. According to the World Health Organization, these molds can produce mycotoxins that cause adverse health effects ranging from acute poisoning to immune deficiency and cancer. More alarmingly, our inspector found Hunt also botched the remediation effort by ignoring and mishandling of asbestos tiles our inspector found in the bathroom. Failed containment efforts exposed our possessions, toys, photo albums, furniture, and school books I used to homeschool our children to carcinogens. When they finally did an air test, they covered our goods in plastic, rendering the test invalid. Our belongings are still in that home. Hunt has fought us the entire way on replacement costs of the last items, offering us only a fraction of the replacement value. I worry about the young airmen that can't afford to pay the $2,700 out of pocket like we did to have these tests to prove what Hunt's doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gerdovich. And I'm sorry for what your family has had to go through. Again, your house should not be your enemy. And I thank both of the witnesses for your remarks. We'll proceed in the standard 5-minute rounds, alternating sides, recognizing members in order of seniority as they were seated at the beginning of the hearing. And each member should be mindful of your time and allow the witnesses time to answer questions within your 5-minute turn. And I'm going to yield to the gentleman from Georgia because he has to go chair his own hearing at 11 o'clock. So, Mr. Bishop, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. I thank the chair for yielding to me and for your courtesy. I do have to go and preside at another hearing that's simultaneously scheduled. But Colonel Gerber and Ms. Gerdovich, thank you for your testimony. It's enlightening and insightful to hear from you. And we really regret what you've suffered through dealing with private housing providers. But rest assured that the committee and the members of Congress are here to support you, and we want to ensure that your voices are heard. Let me just ask you, what, if any, meaningful changes you feel that the housing providers have already accomplished, if any, and do you feel that they're addressing the problem, or you think that they are sort of holding you off to wait to see what the committee will do, or the Department of Defense will do, just to try to, I guess, keep you at bay? And tell me if you believe that the burden is with the housing providers to make improvements, or do you believe that there needs to be more involvement from DOD and individual installation commands? Just for background, I'm the co-chair of the Congressional Military Family Caucus, along with Congresswoman Catherine Ramage-Rogers of the state of Washington. And each year we hold a summit to meet with stakeholders and families to hear issues that affect military families. And this year I want to invite you to come and to share your story and your experiences in this situation with others. You've both been very firm advocates for the expansion of military family tenant rights, and I appreciate that very much. And I'd like to know if there are any additional things that you think that we can do to give tenants a voice and the ability to control the outcomes. So please, have at it.
Thank you, Congressman Bishop. And again, thank you for the bill you sponsored last year that emphasized the importance of military families. And I think the first thing we can do to improve the situation is to bring military families into the formal process, military families and advocacy groups. I mean, Military Family Advocacy Network did great work. I think the second thing we would ask for Congress to do is to continue the fire until this Bill of Rights gets done. Right now, we've got to give service members control of their BAH so that they are the ones that are in control, that they have the ability to hold the contractor accountable when they fail to perform. They need a dispute resolution process, and I need to speak up, and they need an easy mechanism to stop that BAH. Finally, the maintenance is important. We're coming up on, the maintenance history is important. We're coming up on the summer PCS season. Had we known that 4542 had a history of water damage and mold, Sandy and I would not have gone into that house. And so while the companies will talk about investment, my written testimony talks about what we saw when Corvius brought in a third-party contractor, and it wasn't very it caused concerns about the quality of that inspection. So there have been some improvements, but I think we need to be very skeptical of the work we've seen and demand external accountability, not someone that the contractor hired.
I appreciate that very much, and I'd like to again invite you to share with us at the Congressional Military Family Caucus Summits, because I'm certain that the issues that you face are not unique just to you and your families, and we want to make sure that we address it once and for all, and we put in place some mechanism to make sure that we can keep a lid on this.
Sure. Ms. Kurtovich, she may want to respond. You still have time.
I would echo that. Independent inspectors would do wonders that report back to the tenant instead of the privatized companies. I spent much of my time overseeing the job because information was withheld from me. So if you had truly independent inspectors, I do believe it's improved. These companies have a quicker response time. I believe they're trying to do that, but it doesn't mean that they're actually fixing the problem properly when they do respond. So for instance, our home had very little visible mold. In fact, just a little bit of mildew, yet all of our bathrooms ended up being gutted. And the only reason we knew that was because our kids were getting sick. So what would I believe be an incredible improvement and would be able to give, something that would be able to give families peace of mind would be to do air quality testing, something that these companies absolutely refuse to do. If I know I'm moving into a home, there is no way I know that it's safe because of the history of what they've done to cover these problems up. And the only thing that assures me that my children would be safe would be an air quality test that would test for those things, the environmental hazards.
Thank you very much. Thank you both.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Judge Carter.
Thank you. And I may be asking some questions you don't know the answer to, and I don't know the answer to them. What contractual obligation does the contractor have to you as the tenant, or to the government as the, I mean, somewhere somebody wrote a contract to build these houses. And what kind of maintenance obligation do they have under contract, or do you know?
The privatized companies or the subcontractors they hire to fix the job?
Both.
So, Judge Carter, I would tell you a couple of things. One, you sign a standard contract with the housing provider, but as the tenant, you have no ability to enforce that contract because you can't stop rent. You can't go to a judge and ask them to stop rent payment or force them to fix things. You can't stop rent. You can't break the contract and say, I'm out of this and stop paying rent. Your money keeps going to them. So while there's a contract, and in that contract it says that the house is supposed to be up to local housing codes, there's no way for the tenant to enforce that. There's also contracts with the government, but those are guarded and placed under proprietary information. When families have FOIA'd that document, they've gotten heavily redacted documents under the claim that there's proprietary information. So again, these are all efforts that prevent Congress from exercising good oversight and the families from being on a level playing field.
So it would be your argument that the military is obligated to defend your rights.
Judge Carter, General Perna mentioned in his interview last week, he said soldiers have got to go to the chain of command, and he's right. You know, I was a squadron commander in Fort Hood, and if there were and I failed soldiers because there's a problem there and I didn't realize it. But the chain of command's got to be the exception. These are busy people. The people at Fort Meade and NSA are doing vital work to our national interests. And so the families need to be able to take care of themselves, and the chain of command should be a last-ditch effort. Right now we've got that inverted. And the other point I would make is these young families are very hesitant to go to the chain of command, especially a young spouse. You know, I'm a colonel in the Army. I was friends with Sergeant Major of the Army daily. I called him up. I was like, Sergeant Major, you've got to look at this. This is awful. A private doesn't have that kind of relationship.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you both, which was supposed to be my last question, but I'm going to ask it first because it's a tough question, and I think it's the overarching question that has to be answered. Do you think that privatizing military housing was a good idea? And do you think these issues would either not have come up, been handled better, if the housing was never privatized and instead owned and managed by the military?
Okay, so Chairwoman, I'll lead off. I think it was a good idea. There are a lot of people who say we should go back to military housing. And Second Lieutenant Gerber remembers the disaster that housing was on Fort Bliss. And then in 2001, as part of the privatization, the National Military Family Association testified in front of this committee, and they highlighted that there was like $16 billion in maintenance it would take the government to work 30 years to work through. So privatization brought in a huge influx of capital that is allowing the modernization of homes. What we didn't quite get it right. We failed to establish correct oversight, and these companies took advantage of it. So rather than going back to a failed model, let's use the leverage we have on these companies to force them to renegotiate the contract, incorporate the Tenant Bill of Rights, and let's get on with giving our families decent housing instead of arguing over whether I should be able to withhold my BAH.
Do you agree? It's okay if you don't.
Yes, if there is proper oversight, then I agree that the military needs to spend its time doing other things, and it's a good solution to have someone else manage it if they can manage it properly. But in the face of all of these failures, it's hard to say that it's been a good idea.
So we did fund a layer of oversight that did not exist before, so hopefully that will at least be beginning to help. But now that I asked the overarching question and got that out of the way, I want to ask you some more detailed questions. Both of you mentioned working with outside inspectors. Did you encounter pushback in bringing in outside home inspectors, and what was the cost to you and your family for that inspection?
We absolutely had to bring in an outside inspector because from the beginning, before remediation went underway, I made it very clear that the thing that was the most important to me was to get samples for the type of mold that our kids had been exposed to. I even wrote an email the morning that the construction crew told me they were going to begin cleanup to the head of Hunt Maintenance. And I asked him to please just...
Was there any pushback, though, in you bringing in an outside inspector, or were you just able to do that?
He said I could do that under his authority if they let them in the house and he was there. But I...
The person from the company?
The private, yeah, the Hunt said that, the private inspector. I had already gotten him inside the house and tested before he responded to me with that. But we had to pay $2,700 on the spot to get that testing, and that's testing that they still refuse to reimburse us for.
Ma'am, our experience with private inspections is the reason we're convinced that that's got to be part of a three-legged, a three-legged oversight that includes Tenant Bill of Rights, independent inspections, and bringing the families into formal processes. Mm-hmm. We didn't ask, we just did it. I mean, I'm a colonel, I can get away with that.
Right.
And so he was the person who found the mold that was blowing on my wife and I for months. And then as I said, we brought him in to look at 16 other homes for families, and he found levels of mold that were just astronomical. And what that did was it gave those families ammunition to go back to Corvius and say, look, this house is contaminated, and there wasn't any debate about it. Mm-hmm. So we didn't get any pushback. I think the military leaders I dealt with appreciated that we put some science behind this. And it really convinced me that having an independent inspection regime is critical for this. And my wife refuses to tell me how much we spent on the inspections.
It's the only reason they're listening to us,
yeah.
I believe.
It is. It's the only reason they listen.
Excuse me. Before my time expires, how confident are you in the quality of the repair work and remediation that's been done in your homes?
Very not confident at all. I stood outside my house throughout the process to watch things happen. They did an air quality test in which they were going to tell us that our belongings were safe after they aggressively stirred up the asbestos fibers to see if they were in the air. But before they did that, I took a picture to show that they had finally ducted ventilated the air to the outside instead of the inside. And we noticed in that picture later that the goods that they were testing to see if they had been exposed to asbestos had all been covered with plastic prior to the testing. It was only when I pointed this out to Hunt that they agreed that they had many points of failure and finally offered to replace our things. If I wasn't there, they would have never caught this and called our goods safe to bring home to my kids.
Okay.
Chairwoman,
My time's expired so quickly.
I'd agree too, because our written testimony documents a number of dubious practices, both with remediation of our house and with the families we helped. There is a persistent pattern of really inadequate or incompetent remediation.
Thank you. Mr. Rutherford?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would you repeat the three legged stool that you're talking about to fix this? You mentioned the third-party inspection report.
Yes, sir. Based on our experience, we think there's three things. One, you need the full tenant bill of rights. The document that was released last week misses the three things that the service members need to be able to fight on an even footing to force the contractor to meet their contractual obligations. Second, you need to bring in independent inspectors. As both Lynn and I have talked about, the only way we got leverage, and the only way we got leverage for a dozen families on Fort Meade, was bringing someone from the outside in who was calling balls and strikes as opposed to what the contractor wanted to hear. I would also add that managing a billion-dollar housing project without outside inspection on a regular basis doesn't pass the common sense test. The third thing is, and Congressman Carter and Congressman Bishop really hit this in 2019, we saw that the families can be a game-changing innovation in oversight, because if they believe they'll be listened to, they'll come forward and they'll highlight the problems and they'll get it out there. On the other hand, it's the military. If they don't think they're being listened to, they're just going to shut up and color, because it's what we do. It's our culture.
You mentioned earlier, back in '96, when they were about to make this change, that there was, did you say $30 million or $30 billion worth of work?
Sir, according to the National Military Family Association testimony in 2001 in front of this committee, I believe they identified $16 billion in maintenance that was required to bring the homes up to standard.
And are there any reports or studies out there to show how that has moved forward? Is it better now or worse now, or do we know?
I don't think we know, Congressman. And again, this is another advantage of the Tenant Bill of Rights. If these kids could actually come forward and fight, and they had a dispute resolution mechanism, all of a sudden you'd start generating data that this committee could use in its oversight role.
Okay. And I would suggest too that if you're going to use these independent inspectors, it ought to be pre and post. It ought to be what's happening in your home now, and then after they remediate, they ought to be going back, testing it again. It's not a one-time thing, and then they remediate, and then the assumption is that they've taken care of everything. Now they should have to show you that they've taken care of everything.
They show you with their
Did
own
they do that?
But they show that with their own hired subcontractors, ones that have proven to not be trustworthy and have falsified reports. So our own inspector wasn't invited back. In fact, we were told it was a conflict of interest for him to come.
And clearly that's something that I think we need to look at as a committee. And in the Bill of Rights, the Tenant Bill of Rights that was just discussed, last week, I think. Have you had a chance to review that yet?
Yes, sir. So the Secretary Esper passed out the Bill of Rights with the rights he was able to get completed. 3 critical rights were missing. The dispute resolution process, so if I have an argument with my housing provider, there's a process for me to go and get that adjudicated by an independent party.
Right.
The ability to withhold BAH. So the problem is, if they don't follow the contract,
Yeah.
even if I break my contract, they still get my rent. So BH withholding, and then a 10-year maintenance history. Particularly given the history of these homes' maintenance, that the Bill of Rights that was supposed to be passed should have given them access to the last 10 years so you can see, do you have a home with a history of mold or a history of water or something like that? We've
Kind of like
got,
to do with automobiles.
yes, sir. We've got to get this fixed. This is, and the military wants it, Congress wants it, and the family wants it. So I would argue we could use some help influencing the last group of people to come along and get it done.
And if it has no history, then they can do these things like the air quality tests
To show you.
to show that it's safe because they haven't kept records. And let me
Thank-
clarify
thank-
my last question.
Sure.
He could come out, they just wouldn't pay for him to come, and we weren't ready to spend another almost $3,000.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Case?
Colonel, can I just go back to Mr. Rutherford's questions? Because I want to focus in on what your actual recommendations are and how they would change this current situation. So I'm just going to tick off your issues here and make sure I understand them. So I think I'm pretty straight on withholding the BH. That's not an option today, right?
No, sir.
It goes straight from the military to the contractor.
Right, and the
So-
service member has no ability to turn it off.
Okay. Are there situations where the military itself does not pay that over to the contractor? So in other words, do they have the option of doing that if they
No,
have
sir.
a master, as far as you know, under the master contracts the military has with?
In my case, to get my rent turned off, I had to go to the garrison commander, another colonel, and he had to go to Corvius and twist their arm to get them to turn off my payment of them.
I'm sorry, so who turned off your payment?
Corvius turned off my allotment to give them my rent. The garrison commander couldn't do it, and I couldn't do it. Corvius had to turn it off.
Okay,
That's the critical point. If I have a dispute with a landlord on the economy, I say I'm breaking the lease and I walk away and stop paying him. So he has incentive to meet me halfway.
Correct.
That doesn't exist.
okay. And similarly, just so I'm clear, what doesn't exist is the ability of your garrison commander to turn it off, either if your garrison commander agrees with you that something is amiss.
Correct, sir.
Okay. And then dispute resolution, do you have kind of a more detailed sense of what kind of resolution that would be? Would it be, binding arbitration? Would it be, you
Sir,
just
I
want
think-
to kick it into a third-party atmosphere, right?
Yes, sir. And I think if you have a dispute with a landlord in, say, Fairfax County where I live, I can go to the county, I can go through the courts. There are a number of mechanisms. None of that exists for a service member. And so in our case, we ended up in front of the garrison commander, and he looked at me, he's like, Scott, I really don't know, I don't have any authority, and I don't know how to make heads or tails out of the story that's in front of me.
Okay. And then, I'm sorry, I missed the third one. You were talking about a 10-year, what
So
was that again?
the third element missing out of the Bill of Rights is the 10-year history. So there was the contractors were supposed to give families a 10-year history on the home. So in our
Oh, I
case,
see.
since my wife has mold allergies, if they had told us the house had been filled with mold in the past and had water damage, we would have kept looking.
Okay, so what is your understanding of that seems to be a pretty simple thing, relatively simple thing to provide. It's just an inventory on, I presume, complaints on the home, improvements on the home. I mean, do you have a sense of why that is not something that's pretty routine?
No, I do not, sir.
Anybody ever said, this is why we don't want to do that?
No, sir.
Okay. And then bring families in. What do you exactly mean by that? I mean, are you talking about the kind of a family representation in terms of the relationship between the military and the privatized housing contractor, or between the contractor and where would the families come in and how?
Sir, I think you need to bring the families in formally on a couple different levels. One, we have a long tradition of having village mayors. Each little housing group would have a mayor, and then they would come together and be a rapid point to get issues resolved with garrison or the contractor. Right now we have post-town halls. What I would ask is if we have public-private ventures, why don't we form a board of directors that involves the military, the contractor, and these mayors, and give them power to influence, awards and things like that. And then out of that group, people like General Perna or the secretary could bring members or folks like the VFW into negotiations with the partner, and I think it'd be very powerful for them if if the contractors start talking about things and you have families who are representing the tenants, you have real-time information in that. So when we talk about fix the tenant bill of rights, do independent inspections, and bring families into the formal process, the first three things you talked about are fixing the tenant bill of rights. The last two are the other two legs of that stool that I think gives you good oversight of the
Correct.
problem.
I get it. Okay, and then just external housing inspectors, I completely understand the perspective on that. When would you envision that would be advisable? Like at the beginning of the tenancy, or as soon as there's a complaint, or I'm just sorting out how that would actually look in practice.
Representative, I think it would happen in two different places. One is if you have one of these disputes, all of a sudden you have a third-party qualified inspector. Second, when you're handling something like, I think there's about 2,000 homes on Fort Meade, randomly sample a percentage of them every year and see if what we're getting reported is accurate. I mean, this is just basic project management.
Okay. And then I guess my final question, I'm not sure how much time I have. Okay, I will cease then. Sorry.
Thank you. All the members had an opportunity to ask questions, and I think it's very clear what the path forward is and what some of the glaring neglect has resulted in. You gave us some good food for thought and very specific suggestions. Clearly, the other three Tenants' Bill of Rights certainly should be added to the Bill of Rights already approved. Everything you've suggested to me is certainly reasonable. It's outrageous that this was allowed to happen in the first place, which is what prompted my question, of course. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, because I was wrapping up. Yes, Judge Carter.
Are these units new construction or rehab? The old buildings that they went in and rehabbed, or are they new construction?
Judge, what we saw on Fort Meade was both. So, for instance, the housing inspector Sandy and I hired looked at 7 new construction and found toxic levels of mold and water damage in 6 of them. The other 16 homes, so whatever 7 minus 16 is, were older construction. 9.
Thank you.
Questions of the tenant? Yes. Okay. Since Congressman Ryan just came in, I want to give him an opportunity to ask the housing residents a question. Mr. Ryan, you're recognized. Sorry to go to you right as you're sitting down, but we were about to wrap up.
Yeah. Get my bearings here.
I've been there,
I
sorry.
apologize, Chairwoman, that I'm late.
Oh, that's okay, no problem. I just didn't want to wrap up without giving you an opportunity.
You know what, Madam Chair, I'll pass and I'll submit any questions for the record.
Okay, okay.
Thank you for your service.
Yeah, of course, no problem. So as I was saying, trust me when I tell you that we are going to stay on top of this. You know, we initially had a hearing with the service representatives. We will be able to ask them questions. The way we're doing the hearings this year is we're having each service come separately for their own hearing, because we thought we could drill down more specifically with each of the services that way, and not really have to ask all of these questions to a whole panel of people across the services. And you know, as we develop our work product, we'll include additional accountability to the degree that we can, and resources if necessary. And we have a full set of panels today, both the private companies after you and and the government following them. So thank you for your service, Colonel. Thank you for your family's service and your husband. And appreciate you appearing before the committee today, sharing the many other families' issues on their behalf. So we're going to allow for a few minutes for the panels to switch out, and for us to switch out the audience members as well. So the subcommittee will stand in recess briefly for that purpose.
Thank you very much, Chairman.